Okay, seriously, like that is like the coolest intro. I'm sorry, I dig that intro.
I love the music.
Oh, I know. That music is from the Twin Paradox. They're actually an actual band called the Twin Paradox, or Paradox Twin. That's what they're called. And my friend Danny is actually the lead singer for that band, and he actually wrote that song specifically for Non Sequitur. That is actually called Non-Seq-Prophecy. And yes, he did write it. So but make sure we don't have any echo. I'm doing you through NDI, so let me check the outsides, make sure that echo is off. Might have been an echo there for a second. But anyways, yes, it is actually true that there has been an update to the atheist page on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which, by the way, is a peer-reviewed source. This is a peer-reviewed paper, even though normally you don't go in and revisit peer-reviewed papers, but, you know, this is an encyclopedia, but it has some substantive revisions, did it not, Jay? Oh, by the way, let me introduce who I got here. Look at this. This is Jay from Hereticals. Welcome, Jay.
Howdy, howdy.
Put your camera down. All I see is the top of your head. There we go. Fixed. Just like that. No, it's good. It's whatever you did with your hand, reset. So, anyways, yeah, welcome, buddy. It's been a while.
It's been a while.
You're usually not doing that weird time zone thing at like 4 o'clock in the morning because you happen to stream with this weird Australian dude.
I know,
named Chris.
Yeah, that weird Australian guy. Yeah, it's just.
Yeah, I try to catch it every so often because sometimes I'm up at that hour, believe it or not, and you know, when I can, I drop by, but for the most part, it's just so early in the morning. But
yeah, because it's like 3 a.m. for you, because we start at 6 in the morning here. So yeah, it'd be 3 a.m. for you.
Yeah, it's like 3 or 4. Yeah, depending on when they get going. So, anyways, okay, so yeah, they can hear you. Everybody says sounds okay. So let's just kind of dive into this. People know by now. I've been talking about this subject for a very, very long time. Been talking about atheology, talking about atheism, and I've always said for how many years that the term atheism is polysemous. It has different usages, and here's some of the usages that are understood as. Some are more profound than others, some are more useful than others, some are more virtuous than others, and some are more ubiquitous and normative than others. And Draper actually has gone in and put some of this in his latest paper, or the latest revision of his paper from March 22nd, 2022, which I think really hits home a lot of these things that because I know you've kind of adopted the same type of position as far as philosophy, that atheism is mostly construed as an actual belief, new doctrine or theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this lack of belief, atheism is kind of fading out a little bit. I think, at least I've noticed some chinks in it from the time zone that you're in, and going forward to like Australian things. Have you noticed it as well?
Yeah, it's how to explain it right. The lack of belief is slowly starting to go away, and it's more of I don't believe. And that for me has always been the case. You know, atheists don't believe. It's not that they lack belief. So yeah, I kind of see the lacking part of it going away.
Yeah, no, it's still out there. I mean, I'm still on Facebook every so often, and even just one person has messaged me, atheism is a lack of belief. But again, they don't understand that there's the philosophical uses of terms, and then there's lay people, right? And it goes the same through science, right? Look, we all know in science, theory means a very specific thing, a well-substantiated body of evidence that explains facts, that explains phenomenon that's not just explanatory, but has predictive ability as well, right? So a theory is something that's been confirmed model. But to a younger creationist, they might say, well, theory just means guess, right? So there's a huge difference between how these terms are used in a specific domain of discourse as opposed to laypersons. I'm not here to explain laypersons. I'm not, a layperson, but we're here to talk about philosophy, a subject we like, right? So why would we use very generic, in non-specific or vague terminology? It makes no sense. So, but I still get it all the time. I mean, atheists are like, "Oh, atheism is just a lack of belief." Well, all of philosophy disagrees with you. It's like saying evolution is just a theory. No, all of biology would be disagreeing with you. Okay, if you have to have the same standard. If you're going to have the same standard for science, have it for philosophy as well. Don't be hypocritical.
I hate that the whole theory thing, because like you said, theory in science is just stated facts. But theory and, well, I have a theory that this happened, is not the same thing. But a lot of people will try to link them together, and especially like you said, within philosophy and science, that's two completely different things. So you got to, once a lot of people can breach that meaning where theory is actually two different things in this aspect, they may start to actually learn a little more and start to understand things better. But they've got to get past that theory doesn't always mean theory.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the atheists that have adopted the more precise terminology have become better at debating the theist, and certainly much better at understanding philosophical concepts. Flamio for $5 says, Roy Sorensen, Fictional Theism Analysis, Volume 75, Issue 4, October 2015, pages 539 to 550. I've not read Sorensen. Fictional theism, I would imagine, is probably something along those position that theism should be something maybe we should adopt, but not necessarily the belief that God exists, but the beliefs of theists, right? The teachings of Jesus, because there are atheist Christians out there. They do exist. Atheistic Christianity is a position where people adhere to the teachings of Christians or teaching of Christ, whatever that may be, but not actually the divinity, right? So it deals more with the nature of the teachings rather than the ontological status of God existing or Jesus being God or the Son of God. Yeah.
And in my case, like in Buddhism, you have Theravada Buddhism, and then you have Mahayana Buddhism, where Theravada is more of the teaching. You follow the teachings of what Buddha said, where Mahayana is you follow the teachings of Buddha with the godly spiritual stuff involved into it. So I am, in my case, I started out Theravada, but I'm slowly moving into the Mahayana, but not so much with the gods, more of the spiritual stuff. So I can understand where they're coming from when they say they're atheistic Christians, because you can study and work on what Christ said, but you don't necessarily have to believe that there was a God or he was the Son of God to actually take on what he talked about, and being a good person and morals and stuff. Yeah, there's some fishy stuff with Christianity, but in the long run, you can live by the teachings of Christ without believing that there's a God. And yeah, I mean, Buddhism, like I said, is a good example of that.
Yeah, I like the fact they have two different versions, right? You have the as you said, the position where the teachings of Buddha, which might have some interesting stuff, right? I mean, I believe that a lot of stuff have wisdom, right? And then obviously some Christian teachings probably have some wisdom in them too, which you can accept or not accept as far as the divinity aspect or the spiritual side of it, right? So
yeah.
So I think that really does make sense there. Let's see here. Oh yeah, by the way, God of Scummer did do a read on this. I haven't watched it yet, so Jeff, I'm sorry for that. I just haven't watched your video yet. It's not that I don't watch your videos. I do. I watch other people's stuff, but I haven't watched it. So Flamin said that's very close. Cool. So I'm not too far off. You usually figure things out, even though I haven't read that particular paper, but I do read papers. I know. You know what's funny, Jay? I've noticed this. there are a lot of people that want to talk about these topics, and then when you bring up something like a peer-reviewed paper, they lose their shit, and I don't understand why.
Yeah, and I don't understand that either, because if I was going to come to you and say, hey, Steve, I want to talk about definition of atheism, I would look for something to review. So I had something to come in and talk to you about. And if you had something that would contradict what I had read about, then I would look into it, because that's how you learn, you know? So to come in and, you like you said, you provide a paper for them to look at, and then they lose their shit about it. Well, you're not learning anymore. You're not here for discussion. You're not here to learn. You're here to spout your rhetoric, and that's it. You're not here to learn what is being said about specific topics. So, yeah, I don't understand that.
Yeah, that's the funniest thing too, because I just had that happen earlier. There's a person who I just go back and forth on all the time who doesn't understand things like set notation, logical notation. I mean, the basic stuff. Again, I'm not that proficient in it. I have had logic. I understand the basics, right? I mean, I trying to publish a paper using logic, but it's not like, it's undergrad level stuff. Okay, I admit this. Okay, it's not graduate level stuff, but it's still more than what the average person probably learns on their own accord. But this person doesn't know any notation, doesn't know any of the arguments, and me and Joe from Answers and Reason are trying to explain to him how to kind of read this paper properly, right? Because he's not understanding the difference between a psychological belief and a propositional belief, even though it can be construed that all propositional beliefs are a form of psychological belief. But there's a distinction being made that I think that Draper tries to get across in this paper that some people don't really conceptualize very well. So let's kind of dive into that, shall we? So this is, again, the Stanford Encyclopedia, which is I would say a gold level, citation. If you cite SEP, you can't get much more authoritative as far as the understanding of philosophy than that, right? I mean, not too many sources are as high up there as Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah.
So this paper originally was written in 2017. Many of us have read the original paper many, many times. And it's really only the first half that has some significant changes to it. But they are substantive. And so I'm just going to kind of read this out. This doesn't have too many changes in it, but there's some. And then we're going to kind of talk about the difference and what I think Dr. Draper is really trying to impress upon people, because I think he goes a lot deeper in this particular paper that explains why the common usage that's getting pretty popular nowadays is not one that should be held to be the case in philosophy. There's some major issues with it, and that it wasn't that long ago that it wasn't even an issue. When you read the word atheism in philosophy, it just meant the belief that God exists. There wasn't any contention there, right? So it's only a more modern thing where people are trying to use it as more of a negative sense.
Yeah.
Lack of belief, rather positive status. So, all right. So he writes this. The purpose of this entry is to explore how atheism and agnosticism are related to theism, and more importantly, to each other. Now, right there, Jay, he's already setting the tone that these are two distinctly different terms. Is he not?
Yeah. Yep. I mean, you can't get any more. I mean, there you go. Atheism and agnosticism, and more importantly, to each other. I mean, you really can't get more.
Yeah, I mean, he just starts right off the bat there. Okay, well, how they're related, oh man. And so he goes on and says, this requires examining of the surprisingly contentious issue of how to best define the terms atheist and agnosticism. There is contention nowadays, right? And it's so funny because the people that try to tell me how they best think it should be defined never can assail the arguments against defining it that way. Not once. They've not assailed my WASP argument. They've not assailed the atheist semantic collapse argument. They've not assailed any of the Draper's arguments. Nothing. They just go, oh, it just is. By fiat, ipsi dixit, Settling this issue, at least for the purposes of this entry, will set the stage for discussing of an important distinction between global atheism and local atheism, which in turn will be helpful to distinguishing different forms of agnosticism.
Now, I got to admit, before you showed me this article, I didn't know there was two different, global and local. I'm like, what are those?
Well, that's from Dixon,
yeah, I
right?
had no clue.
Yeah, Dixon points out that you could be a local atheist to a very specific God, like for Vishnu. I believe Vishnu doesn't. I could be a local atheist, but as global, that means there's any God, at least one God in the universe. I don't affirm that, but I don't deny that. However, she goes into a little more depths of even if there was a God, a global type God of some kind, is it worthy of worship, which is something that needs to be addressed as well. If something like that does exist, should we even give it worship? Right? That's a whole different ballgame whether it exists or not. That's more of a moral issue, right? So he then goes on and says, examination of an argument in support of a modest form of agnosticism will ensue, followed by discussion of 3 arguments for atheism, and 1 argument against a more ambitious form of agnosticism. And I think that's really critical right there, Jay, because he starts off saying there are arguments for atheism, right? Not mere non-belief. He's saying there are arguments to be had that there are no gods, right? And so if atheism is not held propositionally, then atheism cannot be true or not. There is no argument for atheism if it's not true or false. I mean, there has to be some kind of truth value to be had there to argue something is true, right? Now, the theist will say, yes, theism is true. God exists. They're arguing that position. It only makes sense to have the atheist then say, well, no, God does not exist, and that's true, right? So theism would be false, correct?
Yeah, Jeff says he's going to be starting the local and global atheism in his part 2.
Nice.
So,
go ahead and you can read this real quick. I type things.
Where are we at?
The definition of atheism.
Definition. So the word atheism is polysemous in a multitude of related meanings. In the psychological sense of the word, atheism is a psychological state, specifically the state of being an atheist, where an atheist is defined as someone who is not a theist, and a theist is defined as someone who believes that God exists or that there are gods. This generates the following definition. Atheism is the psychological state of lacking the belief that God exists. In philosophy, however, and more specifically in the philosophy of religion, the term atheism is standardly used to refer to the proposition that God does not exist, or more broadly to the proposition that there are no gods.
All right. So let's look a little bit, because that's changed a little bit from this predecessor. I just want to find something real quick here. All right. So I've always said that the word atheism is polysemous. Remember way back when the atheist experience and all them were like, atheism is just merely a lack of belief. That was all Jacqueline Glenn and all these new atheists were out there, all of them, T.J. Kirk, and all these atheists were out there going, atheism is merely just a belief, lack of belief. All of them were saying this, right? All of them had the same mantra. It was like straight out of, you remember that thing with Fox News where all the Fox News correspondents were saying the exact same thing? Remember that little montage? It was just like that. They were all saying, atheism is just a lack of belief. All of them. It was like some kind of like weird cult thing.
Yeah.
And then I and Ozzy and a few other people came along. We said, no, wait. No, it's not just that. There's actually an understanding of atheism in philosophy that has multiple usages, which means that the word is polysemous. It has multiple meanings and multiple understandings, just like the word objective does. So he makes it very clear that in the psychological sense of the word, atheism is a psychological state, specifically the state of being an atheist, right? So when you define atheism as someone who's not a theist, which, by the way, doesn't get you out of the rock issue. It doesn't get you out of rocks being atheist, because I'll explain why, because that's what set theory. But it's basically saying here that in the psychological sense, it is the position that somebody is being defined as not a theist, okay? Which will present problems later down the line, because then you have this dichotomy of either a theist or not theist, and agnosticism goes out the window, which seems to be kind of silly, because what ends up happening is if you define it this way, then agnosticism and atheism become synonymous with each other, so it loses all versatility. But then it says this generates the following definition: atheism is a psychological state of lacking the belief that God exists, which, correct me if I'm wrong, rocks lack a belief that God exists, correct? So that's the problem right there. Is that even though you can specify just as someone, you don't get out of the categorical necessity that if you only have a universe, and in that universe you have a set, we'll call it theist. You have the complementary set, we'll call the not theist, because of every set you have a not. So theist or not theist. So anything that's not in theist is a not theist. And so if you define not theist as atheist, whether it's someone or not, it's just, hey, you're not a theist, therefore you're an atheist. That means that all things not in the set of theism are in the set of not theist, which makes it problematic. So that's one of the things right off the bat, where defining things as psychological, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to have a mind to have that. It's just the lacking of something. It's lacking of belief. Therefore, yes, a rock would be an atheist using these very, very imprecise definitions, right?
Yeah.
So then it goes on to say, thus, Jeff says, global atheist. Oh, never mind, I'm sorry. I like Jacqueline Glenn, but it's a shame she hasn't dived further into these topics. She's changed a bit on a few things over the past couple of years, so I still hold out hope. I don't think so, Jeff. I don't think she even cares. I think she's so egotistical and in her own mindset that who cares? I mean, I find none of her content interesting. I have never found her content interesting. Even when she was doing her atheist stuff, I found it boring, tripe, puerile, jejune, nonsensical, and she was just parroting what she's heard from other people. In fact, she can't, a lot of it was plagiarized from other people. So yeah, she had no original thought whatsoever. Yeah, rocks are vegans because they don't consume animal products, right? Yeah, no, I mean, seriously, if you define veganism as a non non-carnivore, then anybody thinks it's not a carnivore, it's vegan. So you don't want to define things in the negative. It presents problems. But then it gets really interesting here. He says, thus, to be an atheist on this definition, it does not suffice to suspend judgment on whether there is a God, even though that implies a lack of theistic belief. Instead, wait, did I skip too far?
No.
Okay, yeah. Instead, one must deny that God exists. Now, this is pretty interesting here. One must deny that God exists. I've been telling people forever, Jay, deny means to assert negation. If I deny a proposition, it means that I believe the proposition is false. I'm asserting that the proposition is false. This is how deny is understood in logic. This is exactly how Draper means it this way. And this is why when I say, when Matt Dillahunty uses these words and he uses them differently, it's very confusing to the atheist, because the atheist is going, well, Matt, you're saying atheism is not denial God exists. Or if it is, we're in philosophy, it means that you believe it's false. He's like, no, I just deny God existence, meaning I don't accept. Well, you're using it very atypically, and this is where it's confusing for people who want to go learn about atheism, right? Because how is Draper using it here? He's using it to assert there is no God, right?
Yeah.
So to be an atheist under the philosophical understanding, it is somebody who believes, that asserts there are no gods, that upholds the propositional content, there are no gods. Suspending belief does not constitute the requirement sufficient enough for atheism in the philosophical sense, normatively speaking. In other words, what you ought to use to try to understand these papers, or at least in any kind of standard sense. There are atypical usages, not arguing that. But the standard understanding of atheism is still, for the last 400 years, a positive epistemic status, the belief that God does not exist. So when he says instead one must deny God exists, he is literally saying one must affirm negation. Right? Which I think is a huge change from his previous paper. Okay, go. We want to read this metaphysical sense.
This metaphysical sense of the word is preferred over the other senses, including the psychological sense, not just by theistic philosophers, but by many, though not all, atheists in philosophy as well. For example, Robin, I don't know, Lee Poidevin. Poidevin writes, an atheist is one who denies the existence of a personal, transcendent creator of the universe, rather than one who simply lives his life without the reference to such being.
So an atheist is one who denies the existence of a personal, transcendent God. Now, again, this is being very specific to a local God, right? I admit that. But again, but again, a lot of philosophical papers deal with more of a local position of just the Christian God. Matter of fact, much of ASCP is written with the understanding that God is being held as the Christian type God, right? Now, yeah. So I mean, that's fine. That's in what's called the classical theistic schema. Now, I write my papers and stuff like that in the non-classical schema, which is it's fine. Pick one and go with it. It doesn't really matter. But in the non-classical schema, it's any God, right? When you say at least one God exists, it could be Vishnu, and you're a theist.
Yeah. The flying spaghetti monster.
That'd be a theist, right? If you believe that that is a God, right? Transcendental creator of the universe, rather than simply lives his life without reference to some being. So that's one way of accepting an atheism. If you're looking at it from a classical theistic. Now, in fact, what's really strange though, Jay, in the classical theism point of view, if you don't affirm the Christian God, but you believe in some other God, you're considered to be an atheist. Which is not too strange if you think about it, though, because what were the original Christians when the original Christians that denied the state-sanctioned Roman pantheon of gods? What were they called? Atheists.
Yeah.
Atheos, Greek.
Yeah.
I mean,
atheos. Yeah.
Even though that's the etymological roots, without gods. That's not how it's understood now. But the etymological roots is without gods because they denied those gods. They denied worship to those gods. They didn't believe those gods exist, and there's only one true monotheistic God, Yahweh. But they were called atheists because they had denied the other gods.
I never thought about it like that, but yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, words are polysemous. They have multiple understandings. But there is a standard understanding when you read the term atheism in papers. 95 to 99% of the time, it's always going to be the belief that some God exists. Either whether it be the Christian God or whatever, it is always a positive epistemic status, meaning that you're positively affirming something to be the case rather than, I'm just suspending judgment. J.L. Snellingberg says that, quote, in philosophy, the atheist is not just someone who doesn't accept theism, but more strongly, someone who opposes it. In other words, it is the denial of theism, the claim that there is no God. Now, Jay, let me ask you, how many times have I had atheists tell me atheism is not a claim?
Oh, probably tons, because we get it over hereticals all the time.
Well, so my question to those atheists who think that way, why would they think that a peer-reviewed paper from Stanford, one of the most prestigious philosophical departments in the entire world, would allow something like this if that wasn't the case? I mean, clearly that is understood that, yes, atheism is the claim that there are no God, and there have been papers out there stating this. So for them to say that it isn't, it's just fundamentally wrong. Now, they can say, I don't hold the position. I don't use the term like that. That's fine.
Yeah.
But they don't do that. They do a categorical, they do a categorical statement, of oh no, isn't the case. So yeah, I gotta plug something in. So yeah. So can you start with the definition as what else you got to add on this real quick?
I got nothing for that part. What I've got is actually coming up that I thought was actually interesting, but we'll get to that in just a minute. This definition is also found in multiple encyclopedias and dictionaries of philosophy. For example, in the concise Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, William L. Rowe, also an atheist, writes, "Atheism is a position that affirms the non-existence of God. It proposes positive disbelief rather than mere suspension of belief." And then the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy recognizes multiple senses of the word atheism, but is clear on which is standard in philosophy. This is the part that I found interesting here. So it says atheism is the view that there are no gods. A widely used sense denotes merely not believing in a god and is consistent with agnosticism in the philosophical sense. Excuse me. A stricter sense denotes a belief that there is no God. This use has become the standard. So we get a lot of, we mentioned earlier with the lack of belief and stuff, but this one here, it kind of, this is what stood out to me the most on this, was the stricter sense denotes a belief that there is no God.
Right. Because in the stronger sense that actually what it would be connotative of. Right. So when you see the word atheist in the literature, it is connoting to the person, hey, look, we mean it to be this position that there are no gods. There is no God. You're asserting that to be the case.
Yeah. And, it's like, hey, we don't believe there's a God. It's not that we don't lack the belief in it. We just simply do not believe there's a God or gods in that aspect. And, so with this little paragraph right here for me said so much when I was reading this article, because it dates right there. It everything the lack theists say completely is that's not is this. It denotes the belief that there is no God, not that they lack belief, that they believe there is no God.
So why do you think the Lactheists want it to be that way? Now, other than just parroting what they've learned off the atheist experience, which, by the way, it's just a crap show any longer. They lost all novelty almost a decade ago. I mean, when Tracy Harris left, Jen Peoples left, anybody of interest, and it just became I'm the Matt Dillahunty ego show. It lost all interest for me and many other people, and it's gotten far worse even since then. But this show, the Atheological Aholes, it is for atheists to learn about atheism. Atheists call in, and we do have call-ins every Sunday. But it is for atheism, atheists to learn about atheism. We have atheists on the show to talk about atheism so they get a better understanding of it. Because the atheist experience sure the hell didn't explain any of this to anybody.
Yeah, they were just, it got to the point where it was like, we're just going to beat down any kind of argument you have because we say nuh-uh.
Oh my God, I hate that.
You're not going to learn, and you're not going to learn, and you're not going to teach anybody if all you're going to do is go nuh-uh.
I got to fix that. Sorry about that. I got a home here. I gotta watch magic. You believe in spiritual magic? Watch. I'm gonna make the hum just go away with my mind. Can you hear that hum? Can you hear it in the background? Oh, there you go. Yeah. Just went up. Yeah, see, psychic ability. But yeah, so this is actually a really this is new, by the way. This isn't in the original. And if you read Rutledge and you read Rowe, and I have looked in these things long before it came out in this paper. Even in the original, even in Wikipedia, it talks about Rutledge and it talks about Rowe. And so these are things that, again, were put out very long time ago, that when they say multiple encyclopedias of philosophy, dictionaries of philosophy, because this is kind of standard, right? When Rowe wrote, atheism is the proposition that affirms the non-existence of God. It proposes positive disbelief. Disbelief meaning belief in negation, right? When you and it's funny, Jake, because people say, well, disbelief means that you just don't accept something. You stare in disbelief. Well, yeah, but not. These words have different connotations in philosophy. This is, again, what people don't understand. You see the word disbelief in some paper, it might mean, oh, the person stared in disbelief. You see disbelief in an epistemological paper, it means belief in negation. You have to know in the domain of discourse you're reading in. And so this is very clear that atheism is a positive epistemic status. It is the affirmation of the non-existence of God. And again, I do recognize that he is using God here, by the way, as Yahweh, okay, or the Judeo-Christian deity. But really, in the broader sense, it's any deity.
Yeah, I mean, they probably just use God as just a simple, without getting too, because I mean, if they were to list all the different religions, this paper would be 50,000 pages long.
I agree. Yeah.
So it's in a situation like this, I can accept that they're using just the word God to express all gods or any gods for that aspect.
Yeah, and I think that's the way to go about it. Again, I generally do it in a more a global sense, right? Because when I say I'm suspending judgment, I'm suspending judgment overall of the existence of a God, right? So it would make sense to have a term that expresses that particular viewpoint, that says, okay, look, when it comes to any God whatsoever, and I'm not going to dive into atheism and those people that, oh, what's a God? Because it's going back to square one.
Yeah,
but it never goes anywhere. But as far as like some kind of intelligent agent that created the universe, just for simplicity, I suspend judgment on that. But that is a vastly different position than somebody who says there are no gods, right? So it would make sense to have some kind of term that's differentiating between non-theism, atheism, and agnosticism, because they do mean different things in philosophy. So it goes on to say the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy recognizes multiple senses of the word atheism, but is clear about which is the most standard in philosophy. Jay, here's a peer-reviewed paper saying, yeah, this is kind of the standard in philosophy.
Mm.
So it says atheism is the view that there are no gods. Matter of fact, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy says the exact same thing. IEP, atheism, the view there is no gods.
Mm.
A widely used sense denotes not merely believing in a god and is consistent with agnosticism in the psychological sense. A stricter sense denotes a belief that there is no God. This use has become standard. A stricter sense denotes a belief that there is no God. This
Mm.
use has become standard. Now, again, it's talking about standard in philosophy. Right?
Mm.
So when people are saying that atheism is merely a lack of belief, they're just not understanding that that's not normative in philosophy. Now, this paper recognizes that, yes, there are other usages. Nobody's ever said there's no other uses. It's not a matter of being correct or incorrect. You can't say, oh, you're using a correct usage or an incorrect usage. No. If you want to adopt atheism as a lack of belief, you're more than welcome to do so. But the problem is you have to be able to rationalize that by overcoming the objections of that.
Mm.
Do so, which to date, no atheist has ever done with me. Right?
I think.
But
I think that, you know, if you want to define atheism as a lack of belief in gods or whatnot, then, like you said, you've got to be able to back that up. Where, you know, when you go, I believe that there are no gods. It's I don't not lack. There's more behind that. I mean, just in the um in the speaking the I don't believe and I lack belief. Just in that point right there, you'll it kind of makes more sense in the terms that people will understand where you're coming from when you say I don't believe or I lack belief. Do you
yeah,
understand what I'm saying?
yeah. But here's the problem, though: there's an ambiguity when somebody says I lack a belief or I do not believe. Why? Because you don't know what their position is. They don't have a
Mm-hmm.
position yet. They're just telling you they don't accept this particular position, right? If I say, "Hey, do you want chicken for dinner?" You say, "No, I don't want chicken for dinner." It doesn't tell me what you do want for dinner, right? So just
Yeah.
not believing something is not a position.
Mm-hmm.
At least not of any consequence, right? Sure, you don't want chicken. I know your position is you don't want chicken. Okay, great. But it's trivial. It doesn't tell me what you'd want for dinner. I don't know
Yeah.
what your position is when you say I don't believe. You could be an atheist that affirms there are no beliefs, or so there is no God, or you can be agnostic and suspend judgment. Both of them lack a belief, but they're vastly different positions.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an ambiguity there. And I don't know why atheists want to have that ambiguity, why they go out of the way to facilitate and promote ambiguous terminology. It makes absolutely no sense to me, especially when in science they like to be precise, but in philosophy, like, whatever. It makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on. Interestingly, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy recommends a slightly broadening of the standard definition of atheism or atheist. It still requires rejection of the belief in God as opposed to merely lacking that belief. And by the way, rejection there is asserted as the belief that there is no God. Rejection is not the same as non-acceptance in logic. In what's called Frege rejectionism, when you say I reject the proposition, it means you assert the proposition is false. It means not the same as mere non-acceptance,
Mm-hmm.
which is a little hard for people to wrap your head around. But rejection means to check off no, as in, does God exist? I reject that. No, God does not exist, right? So rejection is to affirm negation, or to believe negation, actually, more specifically. There's a little bit difference between believing negation and asserting negation, but that gets into speech act theory, which I'm not going to really bother with right now. But to deny P and to believe P, or disbelieve P, are similar but not quite exactly the same, because one has assoteric force, the other one doesn't. At least I'm understanding it when I read the literature. But they go on to say, but the basis for that rejection need not be that theism is false. For example, it might instead that be meaningless. So in other words, this is taking into account ichtheism. Okay.
I'm not. I don't see. I keep hearing. I don't know what ichtheism is.
Sure. Okay. So Atheism and theological and cognitivism are very, very similar. And I had this really in-depth discussion with Ozzy one time on this very specific topic. And I think we came to a very mutual understanding because they're so ill conceptualized in the literature. So atheism affirms that the God talk is meaningless. In other words, there cannot be any coherent understanding when you start talking about God. It's like talking about some made up nonsense that doesn't have any syntactic content to it. There's no object it's even referencing because it's just nonsensical. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Norm Chomsky has a sentence that's grammatically correct. The syntax is grammatically correct, but it's meaningless. And it says, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. I think, was it colorless green ideas sleep furiously, I think is what he says, which means nothing. It's just, gibberish, but it's syntactically correct. So the atheist, when you say God exists, it's like, I don't know what that means. Like, blah, 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 exist. They're saying that it has no meaning, which to me is
okay.
It doesn't make much sense because when you hear the word God, everybody, at least I think, that talks about these topics has some kind of concept that they're relating it to, right? It may be different,
Yeah.
but they have some core things. And so to say it's meaningless, I just throw the BS flag. Now, the theological cognitivist takes it one step further. Because the atheist doesn't hold God talk to be meaningful, then it follows that any proposition that has God in it is a meaningless proposition that's not truth apt. So if I say God exists to an atheist or a theological cognitivist, they'll say, well, that's not a proposition. It's not expressing anything that can be true or false. So the theological cognitivist expressly states that the proposition has no truth aptness to it, while the atheist just says that it's meaningless. But they're very, very close to each other, right? To me, to be an atheist, you kind of have to be a theological cognitivist. I think theological cognitivist is more explicitly somebody who talks about the propositional form of it, but they're very, very, very similar. But under this, with the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they would put that under atheism, and Oppie has that argument as well. He doesn't argue for this, but he has an argument for it that under this understanding of atheism, then atheist would be an atheist.
Okay, yeah.
It's because they reject it, but they reject it because it's meaningless, not that it's because it's false. Big difference. Okay.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Now that makes more sense because
So if you say Burgle Glurgle exists and I reject that, it's really more I'm not accepting it because again rejection is the falsity of it. But if I'm not accepting it, it's not necessarily saying that it's false. It just means that I don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it goes on to say, oh, you know what? You go to read the next part.
So it says, according to the most useful definition, an atheist is a person who maintains that there is no God. That is, that the sentence God exists expresses a false proposition. In contrast, an agnostic, in epistemological sense, maintains that it is not known or cannot be known whether there is a God. That is, whether the sentence God exists expresses a true proposition. On our definition, an atheist is a person who rejects belief in God, regardless of whether or not the reason for the rejection is the claim that God exists expresses a false proposition. People frequently adopt an attitude of rejection toward a position for reasons other than that it is a false proposition. It is common among contemporary philosophers, and indeed it was not uncommon in earlier centuries to reject positions on the ground that they are meaningless.
Okay. All right. So, according to the most usual definitions, right there, an atheist is a person who maintains there is no God. Okay, the usual definitions, right? Again, these are typical. This is what I've been saying all along. This is typical in the literature. This is typical in philosophy. I'm not saying atheists have to adopt it, but for them to say that's not standard, it's not typical, it's not normative, it's not even something that exists, they're wrong. It's just objectively wrong. I mean, it boggles my mind to have it, be in the same category as non-believers. I'm a non-believer. You're a non-believer. That you have people out there just saying objective facts are wrong. I mean, it's just inconceivable to me when here it is again saying the same things that I've said for how long?
Yeah, but Steve, you said it, so therefore, nuh-uh.
Right? And so it goes on to say, that is, the sentence that God exists expresses a false proposition. Yeah. Again, propositionally, if theism is the proposition God exists, it only makes sense to make atheism proposition that God does not exist. They're contradictory to each other, meaning that if one is true, the other must be false. They both can't be true and they both can't be false. That's what a contradictory is. So it makes sense. If God exists, theism's true. If God does not exist, atheism is true. That can only be if they're propositional. Right? If atheism is mere lack of belief, then it can't be true or false. It doesn't work that way. It has to be a contradictory to be true or false. So if God exists, theism is true. But if God doesn't exist, then what is it? What do you say then if you don't have a position that represents the falsity of that? If not atheism, what is it?
Flying spaghetti monster.
Yeah, I mean, atheists that just don't ponder these things really kind of upset me, because it's like they talk about atheism a lot for 10 years, and yet they don't grasp something as simple as propositional logic, that if you have a proposition, you have the negation. And so if God exists, then it makes sense to say theism is true. How does it not make sense then, if that's not the case, if God does not exist, to say atheism is then true? But that could only be if atheism is propositional and not psychological. So the lack of belief definition doesn't work to make that contradictory the case. It doesn't suffice to establish the logical necessities of a contradictory. Oh, say that 5 times fast, Jay.
Yeah, no, I'm not even going to try.
I wonder why this crap takes a lot out of me. Ooh, I'm telling you. Okay, so in contrast, an agnostic in the epistemological sense, okay, and now notice he points that out. In the epistemological sense. Because if you read my Agnosticism 3 Ways, I distinctly tell people agnosticism has 3 major usages. One is the epistemological domain, which is the knowability of gods. But the ontological domain, meaning the existence of gods, is a completely different understanding of the word. And they get conflated all the time. So in contrast, an agnostic in the epistemological sense maintains that it is not known or cannot be known whether there is a God. And that is whether the sentence God exists expresses a true proposition. Exactly. But that's in the epistemological sense. Not in the ontological. In other words, when we're talking about God existing, if you say I'm agnostic on that proposition, it just means you have no belief either way. It has nothing to do with knowledge. And I think a lot of people have a hard time conceptualizing that. Okay, so let's see here. Where are we at here? All right, so on our definition, let me check the live chat here. Sorry. Hi, Sarah. Sarah just showed up. Hey, Sarah, would you like a wrench? Let me know if you like a wrench, Sarah. I need one more mod. Not that Kano doesn't do a wonderful job. She does. She hits me if I say otherwise. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. No, but she does give me dirty looks. I'm not even joking. See?
Jeff said Jay's philosophy is theological non-coffeeism.
Oh, I got my coffee right here, bro.
Yeah, I got tea. I'm we're not going into the coffee thing, Jeff.
Sarah says she likes your fedora.
Thank you.
Jay's well.
It actually comes with the actual sunglasses that get the whole Blues Brothers thing going.
By the way, I'm glad you didn't forsake me when I cut my hair. I thought you were gonna like.
No, that just means I have the better hair now.
You do got better hair. Yeah, I shaved but anyway. Sarah likes to clean. Okay, so on our definition, an atheist is a person who rejects belief in God, regardless of whether or not that reason for the rejection is the claim that God exists expressed as a false proposition. Okay, so again, when we reject the proposition God exists, it's saying, I do not believe, or excuse me, I reject because I believe that it's false. It's not just mere acceptance. Again, the standard for rejectionism is the Frege approach, which is for any proposition that you hold as false, you are rejecting it as believing the propositional content is false. And again, this is something that's just pretty well standardized in epistemology. People adopt an attitude of rejection toward a position for reasons other than for a false proposition, which again is the case. You believe it to be something. You believe it to be not true, but you believe it to be not true and hold it to be meaningless without asserting it to be false. But again, in classical logic, not true is false, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's some problems when you start getting into these nuances of propositional logic and beliefs, because if you hold a proposition to be false, if I believe it to be false, right, you are kind of asserting the propositional content, even though there's some disagreement on whether you are actually making an assertion when you hold a belief. Because if I tell you, Jay, look, I believe I hold a cup, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not asserting that, because I'm just giving you what's called an autobiographical assessment. I'm just telling you my doxastic state. I believe there's a cup here. That doesn't really seem to have an esoteric force behind it, rather than saying, hey, Jay, this is a cup. Hey, Jay, there's a cup that exists. Those are more esoteric, meaning they have some kind of force behind them, rather than me just saying, hey, you say, hey, Steve, do you believe there's a cup there? Yeah. I'm not necessarily asserting that. And that's,
Yeah.
and the reason for that is because it allows for something called Moore's paradox, or peculiar reasoning, where you can say something to be the case. It's raining outside, but I do not believe it's raining. That's actually something that falls into doxastic logic. So again, really, really complicated when you start getting epistemologically into this stuff. But so they go on to say it's a common among contemporary philosophers, and indeed is not uncommon for early centuries, to reject propositions on the grounds they are meaningless. Again, this is what the ichthyists would say. Okay, I believe it not to be the case, but I'm not necessarily asserting it to be false. And you think about it, an agnostic might be able to say that too, right? I believe that I have insufficient reason to accept it, but I'm not asserting it to be false. That has a positive epistemic status of some type, right? I believe I do not have sufficient reason. Evidential agnosticism. You're like, I should have stuck with science, true philosophy. Stuff's complicated, right?
Yeah, it is, and I was never one for philosophy, and until I started studying Buddhism, and then it is over the years I have gotten more into it. I'm not like you. I can't quote papers, I can't quote theories and things like that, but I understand where arguments will come from better now than before, because before I used to think philosophy was stupid. Like, why would
we've
you?
all been there, dude. 10 years ago, I was like that. I've always told people, look, 10 years ago, I was that guy. Oh, philosophy is just smoking a cigar and drinking scotch. I still drink scotch. Don't smoke, but I drink scotch. But yeah, no. And then what happened was I met somebody who was a PhD in philosophy, young kid, he had a PhD when he was 27. This dude kicked my ass, dude. He was like running circles around me, and I'm like, I don't like this. I graduated nuke school. I used to train people to operate nuclear reactors, as you know. I'm not super genius level by any means, but I'm above average, I like to think, or at least I'm not an idiot, depending on who you ask, like former business partners. But I mean, for the most part, I like to think that I at least have some kind of intelligence level. And so when he was running circles around me, I'm like, and so I started learning more about philosophy, and then 10 years later, I have a vested interest. Yep.
Yeah, for me, it's philosophy has its use, but in your standard everyday conversations with people, philosophy is not going to come up quite often. But you will get to them points where you will actually talk to somebody who has that philosophical brain. My son developed that in that philosophical brain, so I had to start learning. And I'll admit too, because my wife's in the chat, she'll say that I try not to, but I do try to understand where he comes from now, because he's philosophical, and so learning it, and I understand a little bit more here now, listening to other people. I can understand where that will come into effect, especially in the case what we're talking about today, the definition of atheism. But there are people out there that all their conversations have to be philosophical, and I don't think that's the case. You don't have, every conversation doesn't need to be philosophical. But if you want to talk with those people, you got to have some kind of understanding of where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I have actually listening to more. And like I said, with studying Buddhism has opened it up to where I can actually look at that better. But in this example, we're talking about atheism. If you don't understand philosophy, then yeah, this is all going to sound garbage to you.
Oh,
This
yeah.
is all going to sound made up nonsense that they're going to go, nuh-uh.
Yeah, I mean, like Sarah had asked, who's a physicist that wrote the paper against philosophy? Yeah, that was Weinberg. Weinberg is a theoretical physicist. And again, Weinberg is the only one that's talking about philosophy. I mean, Hawking talked about philosophy as well. But a lot of these physicists, when they're talking about philosophy, they're talking about this like non-resurgence of philosophical concepts, because things in philosophy, when it comes to science, are pretty stagnated right now. The reason being is most scientists adhere to what's called scientific naturalism or metaphysical naturalism, but they also adhere to what's called scientific realism, or at least scientific instrumentalism. But there used to be a kind of a disagreement between scientific realism and scientific anti-realism, and of course with instrumentalism, which is basically the position that, hey, as long as the shit works, we're going to use it. But scientific realists would say that yes, these scientific theories really do represent these models. And so like Hawkins came up with what's called model dependent realism, which is a very specific type of scientific realism. So he was like, hey, look, we haven't really progressed in physics, or philosophy, when it comes to science and philosophy, and they're kind of right on that, because it's at some point it's really hard to determine what is reality, and that is in the realm of philosophy. But there's not a lot of movement in that area, and I completely agree with him on that. Now, I haven't read Weinberg's work. I know of him. University of Austin, Texas dude. But there's an all. All right, so moving on. Yeah, at least until recently, the standard metaphysical. This is really important. At least until recently, the standard metaphysical understanding of the meaning of atheism was so ingrained in philosophy that philosophers could safely use the word, quote, atheism in the sense without worrying that they may be misunderstood, without feeling any need to defend it. Now, I want to make this very clear. I've read the rest of this. Jay's read the rest of this. And most of you have read the rest of this. Draper's not going on to argue that all of a sudden we should start using the other usages. Matter of fact, quite the opposite. He still believes that this should be how it is. He's just pointing out that even up until recently, this wasn't even a non-issue. This was a non-issue. Mm-hmm. It's only because you have these lay atheists out there pushing for this lack of belief atheism, but they've even had to go in and had to revise this, because they're like, wait a minute, this is not how it's normative in philosophy. There's reasons why it's not this way in philosophy, and you shouldn't use it this way in philosophy. He goes on to argue that, and he gives reasons why you shouldn't use it in philosophy. Now, if you want to use atheism and lack of belief in your own groups, knock yourself out. Go ahead. I don't give a shit. But just don't label me an atheist, because I'm not an atheist merely because I lack a belief, because I have a higher understanding of these things. Mm-hmm. Right? I use philosophical terminology. You cannot label me because somebody wants to use the sensu lato understanding, right? In a very broad sense. Sure, knock yourself out. Call yourself whatever you want in your groups. I don't care. I'll call you whatever you want. But don't call me something that I'm not, because atheism is not my philosophical position. So when you label me an atheist, you are misidentifying me. You're misphilosophizing me.
Yeah.
You can misgender somebody, you can misphilosophize them.
I have got to the point where with the Buddhism, because over on Hereticals and in a lot of the communities, I am surrounded by a lot of atheists, and I'm always labeled as the theist, because I do believe in Buddhism and the teachings of Buddha. I don't find it's necessary to correct them that I am more an atheistic Buddhist than I am a theistic Buddhist. So I just let it go, because that argument for me is not necessary. If they understand that I don't believe in the God,
I get that when it comes to you, right? And it comes to me.
For me.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. It's when they categorically make statements that are just, oh, atheism is not a belief. Well, yeah, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. Now you can say that's not how I use the word. Okay, great. But in philosophy, that is what it is. So when you say that's not a belief, you're just when they say it, they're just categorically correct. There's no other way to describe that other than wrong.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say there though is for that aspect, they say I'm the only theist in the room. I'm agreeing to that statement there, but I am not agreeing that all Buddhists are theists. So when they say all atheists lack belief, you're jumping that all in instead of just saying, hey, Mike over here he's a lack of belief atheist instead of a doesn't believe atheist.
Sure.
You can't group everybody in one because of one meaning if you don't have the backup for it. You can accept that somebody calls you a theist or a lack the atheist, whatever. That's fine. But you can't group them all if you don't together, and that if you don't have anything to back up what you're stating, what your statement is, and that if somebody challenges you on that definition.
Right, and they don't back it up at all. Matter of fact, blow your mind here. Theism is a lack of belief as well. It is a lack of belief that God does not exist. Now, we understand just because of discursive conversations, right? We're having a conversation. We understand just by implicature that when somebody says lack of belief, they do mean it lack of belief God exists. I get that, right? Because we understand, because we have so many discussions when somebody says lack of belief, they are specifically talking about the lack of belief that God does not exist. But a lot of atheists don't recognize that theism also contains a lack of belief. Every belief has a lack of belief. They're coextensive. If I believe P is true, I lack a belief P is false. If I believe P is false, I lack a belief P is true. They're coextensive. You cannot have one without the other. And so when the atheist says, I lack a belief that God does not exist, and I want that to be atheism, this goes to my WASP argument. Whether the theist comes in and says, well, theism is a lack of belief that God does not exist, and I want theism to be a lack of belief that God does not exist. And you have to allow that, or that is by definition special pleading. That is the WASP argument. Weak atheism, special pleading argument. Nobody's assailed that. I got somebody on Twitter yesterday. They're like, "Oh, I've already disproved your WASP argument." Oh, really? Can you explain what the WASP argument even is? Nope, couldn't do it. I'm like, if you can't explain the argument, then how the hell do you defeat it?
Yeah.
But yeah, so every belief has a lack of belief. So it really makes no sense to define something in the negative sense as a lack of belief, because then the theist can do it as well. Because theism is a lack of belief that God does not exist. The belief entails the lack of belief. So a person who says, I believe there are no gods, implies by entailment that they do not believe there are no gods. They don't believe there's a God. So, all right, so moving on here. So he makes it very clear that, yeah, until recently this was a non-issue. This is why I think he had to come in and revise this. Not because he was giving credence to it. Not that he was, saying, hey, this is what we should do. He was like, no, this is what people are doing this, and they probably shouldn't be. For example, in his book, Arguing About Gods, Graham Oppy, one of the greatest atheist philosophers of our time, another atheist. I love he points that out, another atheist. Repeatedly tweets agnostic in the psychological sense who suspends judgment about God's existence. Again, in the ontological sense, dealing with God's existence, or in the psychological sense, agnostic does not have to do with knowledge. It has to do with suspending of judgment of God's existence. It is the position that you have no position either way. You do not believe God exists, and you do not believe God does not exist. I cannot explain this a billion more times to people. They don't get agnostic means different things in different domains, in different senses, just like atheism does. So in the psychological sense, or the ontological sense, because they're both similar or the same here, then an agnostic is somebody who just merely suspends judgment, has no belief either way. And an atheist is as mutually exclusive categories. Yes, many papers out there will tell you atheism and agnosticism are mutually exclusive. So when an atheist, when these atheists start going around going, I'm an agnostic atheist, I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, I never understood that one.
It's nonsensical. I have never seen a schema that works for it. I've written how many blogs, logical blogs, showing that the schema doesn't work. My last one, I argued against it using two arguments, showing what it would reduce to, why there's one quadrant that just doesn't work when you have four quadrants. And when you have belief and knowledge in a multi-axis system, there's a problem there, because knowledge is a subset of belief. It should be linear. You can't have a subset of a belief when you have a multi-axial system, because you should be dealing with y and x axis that are independent of each other. This is how you do a diagram. But here, the knowledge is not independent of belief. It's dependent upon belief, because it is a It is a measure of belief, right? You have belief, you have knowledge, and you have certainty. So it makes no sense to put it in a multi-axis diagram. And when you see these atheists going, I'm an agnostic atheist, most philosophers look at them and go,
yeah, sure.
because it's just, most of them recognize that it's just either nonsensical, meaningless, superfluous, or ambiguous. At the very least, it's ambiguous. I have shown it to be ambiguous. There's no way. Okay, I'm going to say this with a caveat. There's no way that I've seen that is possible to make a logical schema work with a multi-axial system like that. I don't believe that you can. Now, if somebody can show me a multi-axial system that works, go ahead. But I guarantee it, there's not one that exists in the literature. I've looked. I'm pretty safe to say that there isn't one. But if you know of one, show me. I can't even find any of those diagrams in any journals. They're made up by some idiot that thinks they know philosophy or the epistemology, and then atheists run with it and go, oh, here's a diagram I found on Google. Well, why don't you sit and think for yourself and think to yourself, does this diagram make any sense? No, it doesn't. It doesn't, because if knowledge is a subset of belief, then it'd be linear. It'd be a single axial, not multi. Because anybody if it knows anything about math, the y is the dependent variable of the x. So when you have knowledge as a subset of belief, it's not dependent upon it. It's a subset. It's not a function. Oh, I get caffeine headaches, dude. All right. But yeah, so basically Graham Hoppe recognized, hey, look, I don't even have to tell people what it is. It's just, I use the term and it's understood. Now, later on, when he wrote Atheism and Agnosticism for Cambridge, he literally has to explain to people in the handbook, hey, look, no, atheism is the belief God does not exist. Agnosticism is the suspending judgment. He has to explicitly tell people this. But this was later on. This was 2017 he wrote that. Right? So almost 10 years later, right? Right. You want to read the rest, or I can
Where am I? The only plausible explanation for his failure to provide justification is that he expects his readers to construe the term atheism in its metaphysical sense and thus exclude from the class of atheists anyone who suspends judgment about whether gods exist. Another sign of how dominant the standard definition is within the field of philosophy, it is the frequent use of the term non-theist to refer to the broader class of people who lack the belief that God exists.
Yeah, and by the way, all this is new. All this is added from the original in the 2017 entry, which I've read many, many times. But this is interesting that he notes this, Jay, because again, he's pointing out how dominant the standard definition is. And still is. This is still dominant in philosophy. This lack of belief is not something that's taken over by any means. Draper actually notes this. It's a very small minority of philosophers and educated people that adopt this because there's so many problems with it. And again, until somebody actually learns this in college, they don't grasp this. As a matter of fact, Rationality Rules and Cosmic Skeptic used to crap at me all the time for this, right? Years and years ago. Then they went to school and they went to college, and now it's like, crap, Steve was right.
Hashtag Steve was right.
Yeah, they both have changed their position on this, and now they go, yeah, now we understand why we should define atheism in the positive status. This other weak thing just doesn't work very well logically, syntactically, metaphysically. It has some issues with it. It has lots of issues with it. But I love the fact that they bring up non-theist, right? Because even Wiki tells you that non-theism is an umbrella term. It includes atheists, Gnostics, atheists, other things, but they're not synonymous. Non-theism and atheism are not the same thing. Never have they been the same thing in philosophy. And you don't want them to just be the same thing. Because, Jay, what happens when you make non-theist and atheist the exact same thing? Logically. What happens to all objects? They become either theist or an atheist.
Yeah, okay.
Because this is what's called the law of negation, is A or not A is always true. That's called the law of negation. So you have A or not A. If I instantiate A with something like theist, I have theist or not theist. Simple categories, right? Because in the universal set, you have A and not A. Those are the complementary sets of A prime, which is the complementary set of A, which is in U, which is the universal set. So I have theist and not theist. Now, I do a semantic substitution. I just say, oh, I want non-theist or not theist to be atheist. Okay. Now you have this arbitrary dichotomy, which is theist or atheist. but they're still a member of you, which is the universal set. So now any object, it doesn't matter whether you're a person or not, any object must fall in the set of A or A prime. There is no other options. If you've arbitrarily designated A prime to be atheist, a rock is either theist or an atheist. This is the logic that Aaron Ross of the world use. And by the way, he's not wrong on that if you do it that way. If you do it that way, his logic is what follows out of that. That's the problem with the semantic substitution. This is why you shouldn't do the semantic substitution. Because I can make the semantic substitution with anything. Theist or dog. Not a theist, you're a dog. There's no difference. There is no difference. These are just words. Right?
Yeah. Yep.
Now, dog represents non-theist, right? Doesn't mean you're metaphysically a dog. I could just say I want DOG to represent the word non-theist, right? It doesn't even have to be like a dichotomy, some kind of disjunction between an actual theist and an actual dog. It doesn't have to be that. It could just be a simple semantic substitution, right? Theist or the word dog, but dog means non-theist. So when I say, hey, you're a dog, I really mean, oh, you're just a non-theist. But you walk up to a woman and say, hey, by the way, you're a dog, you're probably going to get slapped. Right? Yeah.
Depending where you're at, you might get shanked.
Yeah, she's making a fist over here. She don't mess around, right? So, yeah, you don't want to do these semantic substitutions because they can hurt, right? So, it's an argument against that. I got a super. Got a scummer for £5 says, what atheism is the belief that no gods exist? I was told that undercover Christian apologism is not atheism. What atheism is the belief that God exists? Well, global atheism, right? I mean, it's like propositional atheism. So propositional atheism is the belief that no gods exist. But I was told that undercover Christian apologism, not atheism. Well, you know who else who got that, Jeff? Was Ben and Joe, right? Ben Watkins from Real Atheology, who's a very learned philosopher, and Joe, a very learned lay philosopher. I have so much respect for both of them. They've both been accused of being Christian apologists and theists. So
is Jeff.
Yeah, and so is probably I love it when somebody says, "Oh, well, Steve's a closet theist." I'm like, how do I believe him? Because I'm a little confused here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Jeff he's actually saying that he was. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't get that because like Jeff is an actual atheist who believes there are no gods. So how does that make him a Christian apologist of some sort? Just by promoting that more stringent, more philosophical usage of term? That's just weird, man. I get it too, don't get me wrong. But it's showing that these people are not at a level to have these kinds of discussions, right? This is the bottom of the barrel, fruit on the ground atheist. Just like you got bottom of the barrel theist, right? There's theists that are so dumb, you don't want to have a conversation, right? You just can't. Well, atheists are not excluded from that. Just because somebody doesn't believe in God doesn't make all of a sudden necessitate they're some genius, okay? They can have really bad reasons for rejecting or not accepting God existing.
Yeah, I forgot Jen Polymathic had been accused at the same time Jeff was.
Yeah, she's an atheist too. I mean, it's just weird. But if she accepts these definitions because she's educated. All right, moving on here. Of course, from the fact that atheism is standardly defined, how many times did he say standard here, Jay?
Quite a few.
Is standardly defined in philosophy as the proposition that God does not exist. It does not follow that it ought to be defined that way. I agree with Dave Draper, right? It doesn't follow it ought to be. There are other reasons why it ought to be, right? There are other reasons why it ought to be, but it doesn't follow merely because it's standard defined in philosophy as a proposition that it ought to be. And that makes sense. I agree with him. That's not the reason why it ought to be. And the standard definition is not without its philosophical opponents. True. For example, some writers at least implicitly identify atheism with a positive metaphysical theory like naturalism or even materialism. Now, this gets into some problems, Jay. I've seen this before. IEP even talks about this. The problem with doing this is that when you assert atheism as this overarching metaphysical theory of just naturalism, you exclude all kinds of spiritualism, where there might be some kind of ontological presence that not necessarily of God. And I find that to be too broad of reach. Now, I do accept naturalism entails atheism, but atheism certainly does not entail naturalism. You can be an atheist. You can say, look, there's no gods, but I believe in telekinesis. I can believe in paranormal activity. I can believe and things that we normally would understood as supernaturalism. But if you say everything is natural, if you do adhere to philosophical or ontological naturalism, that means there are no gods. You're beholden. You're epistemically committed that there are no gods. But would you agree that you probably don't want to define atheism in terms of naturalism?
Yeah. Yeah, we had a little discussion before the show started, so yeah.
Yeah, and he goes on to talk about why, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he says, given the sense of the word, the meaning of atheism is not straightforwardly derived from the meaning of theism, which presents a problem because atheism normally is understood as defined in terms of theism.
Mm-hmm.
Theism is true, God exists. Atheism is true, God doesn't exist. Or if atheism is false, God does exist. Right? There's that nice symmetry there with these contradictories. Anybody cares? The only difference between a contradictory and a contrary is that in a contrary, both can be false, but in a contradictory, it can't. Which is, think about this, Jay. If I said Judaism and Christianity are contraries, it means if one's true, the other one's false. If the other one's true, the other one must be false. They both cannot be true, but they both can be false. Those are contraries, right? Because it could be Buddhism, maybe is true religion, or something like that. But both can be false, but both can't be true. That's the difference between a contrary and a contradictory. A little interesting logic there. While this might seem etymologically bizarre, perhaps a case can be made for the claim that something like metaphysical naturalism was originally labeled atheism, which it was, only because of the cultural dominance of non-naturalistic forms of theism, not because the view being labeled was nothing more than denial of theism. And this goes back. This is a throwback to the 1800s and 1900s, especially, where when atheism wasn't really as substantive as it is now, it was synonymous sometimes with naturalism. So when you see philosophers talking about atheism, sometimes they're talking about naturalism, and you have to recognize the terminology of the time. But again, most standard for 400 years or so I've gone back, atheism has generally been the belief it does not exist, but there was some philosophers who used it in a more naturalistic sense. On this view, there would have been atheists even if there no theist ever existed, just like they wouldn't have been called atheist. And by the way, I hold that you can have atheism without theism. Theist existing, in other words. You can't have atheism without theism, but you can have... let me rephrase that. You cannot have atheism without theism, but you can have atheist without theist being existing. Because if all theists disappeared, right, Jay? All of a sudden, people don't stop being atheist, right?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if every theist just vanished off the planet, would you stop being an atheist? Of course not. So you don't have to have atheist to have atheist. You don't have to have theist to have atheist, but you do have to have theism to have atheism because they're coextensive. If you have one, you have the other, propositionally speaking. Somebody asked, as per Steve McRae, that sounds weird, but atheism seems to be a philosophical term. Then what would the philosophical definition of a god? Would Zeus, Yahweh be a god in the philosophical definition? Yeah, well, okay. I have a very stipulative definition that I use for the term God. I'll give it to you in a second here. But for philosophy, the term God has multiple connotative things to it. Most of these pages are for the existence of a Jewish Christian type deity, but it basically is more along the lines of some kind of intelligent agent or creator being of some kind that created the universe. Okay. Now, my specific definition that I go by when I write stuff that I have in mind, and again, this is not prescriptive, okay? This is just a working definition. I go by this one, and I wrote this. Although if you go to segmentation fault, he has it pinned. But he says, a necessary being or agent with intentionality that all contingents are dependent upon and or can prescriptively change or suspend natural law by having complete dominion over an aspect of nature. This means that some kind of being that must exist in all possible worlds has intentional states, right? It can believe things, it can love things, it can hate things. That's some kind of intentional. These are all intentional verbs. So if I say believe something, that means that something has to be doing the believing. When you say an intentional verb, it means that something has to be doing it. It's action. I love you. Something has to be doing the love, right? I love you, Jay.
I love you too, Steve.
It's the hair. I love the hair. Wear it proudly for us, you know, or that can prescriptively change the laws of nature. Now, to me, that's, again, I consider that a god. If you can say, hey, look, I want the speed of light to be this, and you could change it, you're a god to me. I don't give a shit what dimension you're from. You know, that's just me, though. And then he goes on to say, while this definition of atheism is a legitimate one, sure, it is often accompanied by fallacious inferences that from the alleged falsity or probable falsity of atheism in naturalism, the truth or probability of theism. And that's what he's saying there, is that if atheism and naturalism are synonymous, atheism is true, then that would entail naturalism is true, which means that theism must be false. And I don't think you can make those arguments. I don't think you go from atheism to naturalism to theism, right? I mean, those are very distinctly different concepts. So I don't think you make the inference there that if atheism happens to be true, naturalism happens to be true, theism has to be false then. I don't think you can make those inferences.
No.
Here. The rest, actually, most of this is actually still in the original. I don't know if you want to go through it.
No, there was an interesting quote here by Ozian Talks. It says, I literally heard T-Jump say a couple of days ago that indeterminism is true and free will is false. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what indeterminism is.
Well, free will is determinism. Okay, libertarian free will is indeterminism.
Oh, okay.
So how can you say, if you think indeterminism is true, that implies free will is true. If you deny free will, you're a determinist. Okay, so a soft compatibilist or a hard compatibilist is a type of determinist, which denies free will. So I don't understand how you can say that indeterminism is true, but free will is false. That makes no sense. That makes no sense. Am I missing something there, Ozian? Because if you think that indeterminism is false, you're expressing the position that there is no such thing as free will. That's how it's understood in context of determinism. But of course, T-Jump believes that a rock can create a moral act or immoral act. All right. So, anyways, departing even more radically from the norm of philosophy, a few philosophers, Michael Martin, who I've read, joined many non-philosophers in defining atheism as someone who lacks a belief that God exists. Which, by the way, interesting on Michael Martin, Jay. Even though he advocated in this position, much of his writing is in the positive sense, and he actually says in his book Negative Atheism that lack of belief atheism requires epistemic justification. It requires a burden of proof. This is the guy that promotes this, that lack of belief. So when I tell people, look, lack of belief atheism still has a form of epistemic burden of proof, they look at me like I'm crazy. I'm like, the guy that promoted this this whole implicit atheism thing, it came from him too. This commits them to adopting the psychological sense of atheism discussed above, according to which atheism should not be defined as a proposition at all, even though atheism is a proposition. Instead, atheism, according to these philosophers, should be defined as a psychological state, the state of not believing the existence of gods. Now, again, this goes back into the whole rock thing, right? Psychological state of not believing is not contingent upon a mind. It is just the state of non-belief. A mind can have that state, but other things and then other objects can have that state as well. It doesn't require a mind not to believe something. This is where I think some people get confused. This is the argument that I had with somebody just recently on Twitter. They weren't understanding when we're talking about psychological states, the state of non-belief is still something that exists without a mind.
I don't see how that can. I don't understand that.
All right, okay. It is either true or false. It is either true or not true. This cup believes there's a God. That is either true or not true. Correct?
Well, see, and then that's where, I understand where you're saying, but you'd have to have the ability to believe or not believe for that to make sense.
This cup believes or does not believe. There's no other options, logically. Now, you agree. We both agree it doesn't believe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so there's only two options this cup can have. It believes God exists or does not believe God exists. It doesn't need a mind to does not believe. It needs a mind to believe, but can only fall in one of two categories. Belief or non-belief. There are no other categories because the law of excluded middle, bivalence principle, law of negation, A or not A, believe or not believe. That's the only thing it can be in, one or the other.
Mm.
So it must fall because we agree this doesn't have a brain. So if it doesn't have a brain, it can't believe something. Now, I admit there's some really dumb people out there without brains that have beliefs. It's true. But for all things considered, that the only state that this cup can be in is in the state of non-belief. And it doesn't have a mind. Ergo, you don't need a mind to have non-belief.
But wouldn't it have to have the ability to believe or not believe for it to fall into one of those categories? So, like,
No. It's set theory. Okay, so in the universal set, we'll call that U.
mm,
X is either a member of A or A prime, where A prime is the complementary set of A. So that means that if I say, hey, dog or non-dog, everything in the universe is either a dog or not a dog. There are no exceptions. If it's a dog, it's a dog. If it's not a dog, it's not a dog. We're not dogs.
Yeah.
So everything in the set of dogs is a dog. Everything that's not in the set of dogs is a non-dog. There are no other sets that it can fall into. I mean, there are other sets that are subsets, right?
Yeah.
But everything's going to be a subset of a dog or a subset of a non-dog in the universal. You know? I'm a non-dog, but I'm a human, which is a subset of non-dog in this. If those are the supersets.
Yeah, and I understand that part of it. Yeah, the dog or not dog, the belief or not belief. I get that. But it would seem to me that to fall into the rocks or atheists or the cup is an atheist, whatever, wouldn't it have to have the ability to believe or not believe for that to actually occur in that sense? So if it logically cannot determine whether it believes or does not believe, wouldn't that mean that something like a rock or a cup cannot fall into that category?
But what does it say here? It says the state of not believing in the existence of God. The state. This is in that state. It doesn't have a mind, but it is in the state of non-belief.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a consequence of set theory, which again makes these things very problematic when we start talking about the difference between a psychological belief and a propositional belief. Because technically, propositional beliefs are a type of psychological belief, but propositional beliefs can be true or false. Right? So God existing should be something that's true or false. Because it is either the case that God does exist or God does not exist. That's something that can be true or false. So why define atheism non-propositionally? It makes no sense. There's absolutely no reason to do such a thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the only reason is for demographics, which he does talk about here, which I mentioned a long time ago, for political reasons. And people laughed at me. I'm like, go read Silverman's book, Finding God. Go read Smith's book, A Case Against God. Go read any of these new atheist books. They all talk about this. They're doing it for demographic reasons, for political power. Okay. But they laughed at me for that. I'm like, go read the atheist literature. They're literally telling you, yes, we want it defined this way because it gives people more voting power. And that again, that's a utilitarian type approach, or even a consequentialist approach. Or, that's we want this consequence to change the political landscape. Therefore, we want it to find this, use this way. But philosophically speaking, it's very naive to do so. And I think it hurts atheism in the long run, because if you want to be the intellectual ones, you want to be the one that's so much smarter than the theist, don't cut corners, don't skimp here when you're all gung-ho about science and all this other stuff, but in philosophy, you just go to crap.
Yeah.
This was viewed as famously proposed by the philosopher Anthony Flew when he arguably played a role in his 1972 defense of the alleged presumption of atheism, which, by the way, my paper is actually a refutation of that paper. I only have I have a short version on my blog, but my actual paper is actually refuting Flew's work, because I think he makes some very, very major logical missteps, I think. But that paper wasn't really taken really well by philosophers in 1972. The presumption of atheism has been excoriated by many different philosophers. Burgess Jackson just eviscerates that paper and does a brilliant job doing it. Now, he happens to be a theist, but he still doesn't matter. He really shows that Flew's paper is just trash. The editors of Oxford Handbook of Atheism, Bullivant and Ruse, also favor this definition, and one of them, Stephen Bullivant, who's a theist, as well, by the way, defends it on the ground of scholarly unity, which I think fails. Now, I've read the Oxford Handbook of Atheism, and Oppie is in there, and Bullivant is in there. He wrote the first chapter, but he doesn't make a convincing case for this. His argument is that this definition can best serve as an umbrella term for a wide variety of positions that have been identified with atheism. Scholars can then use adjectives like strong or weak, or positive or negative, to develop a taxonomy that differentiates various specific atheisms. And then Draper explains the problem with this. And he does so exceptionally well. Unfortunately, this argument overlooks the fact that if atheism is defined as a psychological state, then no proposition can count as a form of atheism because a proposition is not a psychological state. Now, yes, you can argue that propositional beliefs are psychological beliefs, but a proposition itself cannot be derived from a psychological state. This means that the proposition of God existing or not existing, the belief that God does not exist, which is a propositional statement, God does not exist as propositional, cannot fall under atheism. Strong atheism does not exist in this schema. It leaves it, as he says, we find out, in the rain. I get foreshadowing here. So he says, this undermines Bullivant's argument in defense of Flu's definition, for it implies that what we call, quote, strong atheism, the proposition or belief in the sense that something believed, that there is no God, is not really a variety of atheism at all. But in short, his quote his proposed quote umbrella term leaves the so-called strong atheism, or what some call positive atheism, out in the rain. And that's really hard to conceptualize what he means by that. But if you think about it, I'll break it down for you really simple. And I'm doing more for the audience out here. I'm not you, Jay. But
yeah, no, I understand.
But if you want to define atheism as the psychological state of non-belief, you cannot derive a proposition from that. Even though on a Venn diagram, the McRae-Knoll Venn diagram that we have out there shows strong atheism as a subset of weak, that's only if you define it propositionally. In fact, if you look at the very top of the Venn diagram, it shows proposition P, God exists. Proposition not P, God does not exist. If you define it propositionally, then strong atheism can be made into this category. But if you do not define it propositionally, you define it psychologically, there is no such thing as strong atheism, because you cannot have a propositional belief like strong atheism from a psychological one. And so Draper's exactly right on this, but it's really hard for people to wrap their head around that, because, well, wait a minute. Both of them lack a belief, but yes, but one's propositional. Even though they both lack a belief, one's propositional, and it makes no sense to say, I'm deriving this proposition from some kind of lack of belief superset. No, you cannot do that. So, all right. I will read a little bit more, then we got to wrap it up because I'm getting tired. You want to read the next part?
Although Flu's definition of atheism falls as an umbrella term, it is certainly a legitimate definition in the sense that it reports how a significant number of people use the term.
Sure.
Again, the term atheism has more than one legitimate meaning, and nothing said in this entry should be interpreted as an attempt to proscribe how people label themselves or what meanings they attach to these labels.
Hang on. So what he means by that, by the way, prescribe means in this case the opposite of prescribe. It is to they shouldn't prevent themselves from labeling themselves something, which is fine. I said the same thing. Look, you want to label yourself an atheist but have an agnostic position? Knock yourself out. It's confusing, and I advocate against it. I think it's making you look philosophically naive and silly, but no one stops you. No one says you can't do it, right? And this is what Draper's saying. Sure, you can do it. It's silly. Here's all the arguments against it, but he's not prescribing anybody from doing it. He's not preventing anybody from labeling. He's not saying it must be this case, right? He's just saying here's the reasons for it. If you want to go ahead and still do it, knock yourself out. But that's what he's saying here. So go on.
So the issue for philosophy, and thus for this entry, in which definition is the most useful for scholarly or more narrowly philosophical purposes. In other contexts, of course, the issue of how best to define atheism or atheist may look very different. For example, in some contexts, the crucial question may be which definition of atheist, as opposed to atheism, is the most useful politically, especially in light of the bigotry that those who identify as atheists face.
Okay, hang on. So this is what we talked about before, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very clear here. It has to do with political reasons. And again, remember 5 years ago, people laughed at me like, "Oh, Steve's a conspiracy theorist" when he talks about atheism being thought of a lack of belief because not for political reasons. Yes, it was. I know Silverman pretty damn well. Okay, I've been on his program. He's been on mine. We've talked. I've read his book. Okay. And by the way, it's fun fact. Silverman will not discuss these arguments with me longer because he kind of knows I know my shit. And he's just like, okay, from your perspective, you're right, Steve. But I still want this to be this way for political reasons. Okay, I got you, boo. I got you.
Yeah.
But he will not discuss these things with me because he knows I will just crap all over him. Because he's backed away from a lot of it as well because he's changed a lot since the firebrand atheist days. Now he's firebrand wokeism and other things. But as far as the atheism, he's kind of like, okay, yeah, Steve has some valid points, whatever. But yeah, he won't go there with me. Look, there's very few formidable people, I think, on the circuit on this particular topic. And I'm certainly not the best. Ozzy's very formidable. Ben, very formidable. Joe, very formidable from Answers and Reasons. Dave, very formidable. And so there are many people out there that are much more formidable than I am when it comes to this particular topic. But we've been around for a while. We and so yeah, Silverman's like, I don't want to do that, Steve. I'm like, okay. But he's cool about it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so go on.
So the fact that there is a strength in numbers may recommend a very inclusive definition of atheist that brings anyone who is not a theist into the fold. Having said that, one would think that it would further no good cause, political or otherwise, to attack fellow non-theists who do not identify as atheists simply because they choose to use the term atheist in some other equally legitimate sense.
All right, let's leave it there because I want to end on this note because this is critical. Because I just have these discussions in these Facebook groups with people that never read a peer-reviewed paper in their life, philosophical peer-reviewed paper. They've never read a paper on epistemology. They never opened a book on logic. Nothing. Zero. And yet they think they're able to explain these things. Now, look, I've always said I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a logician. I have an interest in these topics, and I do fairly decent from the basics. But this right here is a very critical statement because what they're doing is they say Steve's wrong, he's an atheist, blah, blah, blah. And here's Draper very categorically saying it serves no purpose for them to do that. They're alienating people that would be normally their allies. This is what happened with Seth Andrews. He from thinking atheist, he thinks that anybody who's not a theist is an atheist. Matt Dillahunty, Arn Ra, any of those people from the ACA, well, not the ones that left anymore, they may have changed, but the ones that are still with the ACA, yeah, they're doing nobody a favor by trying to say, look, Steve's a non-theist, but we're going to label him an atheist merely because they want to use very, loose terminology when Steve's, I don't mean to speak myself in the third party person here, but Steve uses, more formal language when it comes to philosophy. So by them trying to use their very ambiguous language and their terminology that they would use on their contemporaries in their own communities onto somebody like self, that's so intellectually dishonest, and it helps nobody. Because I don't want to be associated with somebody who's going to do that, because that demonstrates to me they don't know atheism, they don't know philosophy, they don't know logic, they certainly don't know how to have a civil conversation. Because Jay, do I go around telling people they're not actual real atheists? No, I've never done that. That has been
No, I would say not that I've seen.
It's never happened. People have said, "Oh, Steve used to go around telling people they're not real atheists." Show me where. No, all I say is no. In philosophy, you would be considered an agnostic, but you can label yourself anything you want. And they'll be like, that means you don't think they're a real atheist. That's not what I said. Don't put words in my mouth. They're an atheist under that very loose definition. I don't use that very loose definition, so you can't put me under that. So any atheist who says I'm an atheist, they're just categorically wrong. When they say you must be an atheist or theist, they're categorically wrong. There is no discussion to be had there. They're fundamentally, unequivocally, without question, logically, epistemologically, philosophically, wrong. I don't know how to state it.
Yeah.
Now they can say within their framework they're right. Well, I guess I can make a framework say theist or dog, and I mean literally a dog. Well, you're not theist, you're a dog. Well, my framework only means you have to be one or the other. Okay, but that's
Yeah.
arbitrary. That's stupid. But people would look at me like I'm an idiot if I said, well, that's my schema. You're the theist or you're a dog. What's the difference? You're making up this arbitrary dichotomy that I don't adhere to.
Mm-hmm.
And they already know that's not how it is in philosophy. Because Jay, how many times did he use the word standard here?
Quite often.
Oxford says it's standard. Cambridge says it's standard. They also both say it's standard. So there is no argument any longer, atheist out there. What is the standard usage of atheism in philosophy? Get over it. This has been beat to death because you guys are not willing to accept that people that are educated rather use more precise language when they go against a theist that's educated. Because if not, you'll look like a freaking idiot trying to talk to a theist when you don't know what the hell they're talking about. If they start talking about metaphysical necessities and you start thinking, what is necessity? You're going to have a bad day.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's my rant. Jay, what do you got to add on this before we kind of wrap it up? I'm sorry I talked a lot.
No, you're fine. Like I said, one of the reasons I wanted to come on here is because I wanted to learn more, because I stated before, I'm not as big, I'm nowhere near anywhere in philosophy like you or even Jeff, and he's just starting out. But I understand it, and I wanted to read this with you so I could get an understanding of what a lot of this stuff meant. Because when I read it last night, a lot of it to me just was like blugger, blugger, blugger. You know,
blugger, blugger.
But listening to it and you explaining how some of these work, it makes much more sense. And that is one of the things I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to come on here with Steve and talk about this stuff that I know almost nothing about, because I'm willing to learn and I'm willing to listen.
That means a lot. That means a lot, dude. Seriously.
When you asked me, yesterday if I wanted to come on, I was absolutely for it. Absolutely, I'll come on, because it's gonna make me better in my dealing with, because on hereticals we get we're gonna get the Christian trolls every so often.
Of course you are.
But it will help me in the long run when we have to deal with them, in that aspect. So, like I said, it was 100%. It was my pleasure to come on, because I learned stuff.
I've always been a huge fan of yours. I like the way you have discussions, you and Chris, on hereticals. I wish there was more time, more my time. But look, I adore Chris, and I have utmost respect for that man. And he has these conversations. He does a pretty good job, and he's not really that much in philosophy, but he knows enough to, kind of get. I think he did a really good job against Darwin. Dawkins.
No, that was freaking hilarious.
You moderated that.
I did, and I tell you what, it was so hard to sit there and not laugh through that whole thing.
That was brutal, dude. I listened to that. I did listen to that. Now, again, he wasn't trying to be some highfalutin, philosopher that can just demolish, DD on the fly. But he got the main points. But Darwin was just stupid.
Yeah,
just stupid. I was sitting there mortified. I'm like, oh my God, Darwin, stop this crazy dude. You're just an idiot, man. Stop it. He is so bad at philosophy.
Yeah, Dawkins.
Dawkins.
Yeah.
Now I'm not going to read the rest, but I am putting it on the screen. For the people that are watching or will watch in the future, go to the SEP. It's in the read the next part especially, because it really gives the reasons why it is advantageous to define atheism propositionally and as a positive belief. Because and by the way, this is what Matt Dillon got pissed off one time, because I made a flow chart, and the flow chart had the very first question, does God exist? And he's like, that shouldn't be the question to be asking. It should be about belief. I'm like, no, Matt. The very first question should be, does God exist? Because that's the great debate question. And if you answer it yes, you're a theist. If you answer it no, you're an atheist. That is very virtuous. You have the ability to answer yes or no. You can also answer, I don't know, which would be the agnostic position. And which means, by the way, this ordinary epistemic doubt. It doesn't mean anything to do with epistemic knowledge. It just means that I do not have a way to answer this question, yes or no. When you say I don't know, it just means I don't know how to answer. Okay.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with I don't know.
That. But
and that's yes. What I get. And that's the thing. When you deal with theists or in some of the circles we run into, things like flat earthers and some of the other conspiracy theory people, if you tell them I don't know, they automatically jump. Well, then it's true then because you don't know. It's not. No, that just means I don't know,
Right. Yeah, it's
and
not.
I'm willing to say I don't know.
But it needs to be pointed out numerous times when you say I don't know, you're not talking about knowledge. You're not saying that you're missing knowledge about something, as far as the epistemic sense. What you're saying is that I don't have a way to determine whether this is yes or no.
Yeah.
Okay. So would you agree though, if the question is, does God exist? Now I'll ask with the audience and we'll leave it at that. If the question is, does God exist? If you answer yes, that would be indicative of a theist, correct?
Mm-hmm.
If you say no, it's more than just non-theist. You're stating a proposition as being false. Does God exist? No, you're making a statement that there are no gods or that God does not exist. That is what atheism is construed to be. This is why it makes it a nice, virtuous ability to say yes or no to that question, does God exist, by defining atheism propositionally. Right? Because if it's defined psychologically as a lack of belief, then you can't answer that question yes or no if you don't have a belief either way. If I lack a belief, okay, but am I saying that there is no God, or I just don't have a position either way? So, an agnostic is not going to say no, right? Agnostic is going to say, I don't have a position. So it gives you that virtue of saying yes or no, because if the answer no, it can only be propositionally, it cannot be psychological. Again, going back to defining atheism psychologically, it leaves no out in the rain. The answer no to that question is not a form of atheism in that regard, which is silly. Why define atheism psychologically just to say, oh, look, if you believe there are no gods, that's not atheism. Now that entails not believing, which you could argue is a form of atheism, but the belief itself that there are no gods, saying that isn't a form of atheism, is bizarre to me.
Yeah.
Because if you say, hey, Steve, I believe there are no gods, I'm going to say you're an atheist. But I'm not going to say it because you lack a belief. I'm going to say it because you affirm that there are no gods. And for somebody to say, well, yeah, but affirming a god, there are no gods, isn't atheism. Well, what the hell do you want to call it then? Anyways, yeah, Jeff, I gave you a wrench.
I seen it. That was funny because Jeff said, wait, doesn't Dillahunty host a show where people phone in and try to convince him that God exists?
Yeah, to no avail, though. I mean, look, how difficult is it to say I don't believe?
And here's my thing, because I watched Dillahunty for a while there, and he never listens to the argument. He's got it in his head.
Argument?
I don't think he even listens to the argument.
Yeah.
I think he just lets them talk and then goes and picks up a couple things here and there and goes, well, this is why you're wrong, or just gets mad at him and hangs up.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Because you can't just, for me, you can't just discount what somebody says just because you don't believe it. You've got to listen to what they say and see if you can figure out where they're coming from, to understand where they're coming from. If you automatically come in to the discussion and they automatically, you are denying what they're even saying before they start, just because in this case they believe in a God.
I agree.
There's no conversation to be had there. Why are you even talking to them if no matter what they're going to say, you're not going to listen to?
It's just straight up denialism at that point. That's all it is, denialism. Now, you know how Matt always asks for a logically valid and sound argument for God, and that's fine. But I have given out there logically valid and sound arguments for my arguments, not for God. This has anything to do with the existence of God. But my arguments are structured logically through a logic checker. The premises are true, and I present them, and I still have atheists going, well, no, this is wrong. Okay, well, why is it wrong? Is it invalid or unsound? Yeah, well, if it's not valid, it can't be sound. But they cannot tell me what's invalid about it. Some of them will say, no, it's not valid logic. Well, why? I've been through a logic checker, right? Yes, it's valid logic. Oh, the premise is this and this. You haven't given a reason to accept these premises. I don't give a shit whether you accept them or not. You need to give me a reason why you say they're false. Premises are asserted axiomatically in an argument. They're asserted to be true. If you don't accept it to be true, I need a reason, or else you have not assailed the argument. I don't have to prove an axiom. I can say, this is my axiom, premise 1. You tell me whether you accept it or not, and if you don't accept it and you say it's false, I need a reason. If not, you have not assailed it. I'm just asserting it as true. It's true until you give me a reason not to. That's how an argument works. Hate to break the people.
Yeah.
That's not shifting to the burden of the proof. I'm not saying prove my argument wrong. I'm saying is if you don't accept a premise, you need a reason because they are axiomatically asserted as true. They're assumed true.
Yeah.
Now, whether they are true or not, it's a different story, right? Again, just because they're assumed true doesn't mean that they are true. But if I tell you that this is logically valid and sound, I'm telling you the premises are true. I don't have to demonstrate that. I'm telling you that they're true, and you've given me no reason that they aren't true. So why would I change my mind on that?
Yeah.
You haven't defeated the argument. So don't ask to prove a premise. It's stupid. Say, look, your premise 1 is false, and I believe it's false because of this. Okay, well, let's check that out. Let's look at that. But my arguments are logically valid and sound because people like I say, which premise is wrong?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Okay. Let's go through each one. It's premise 1. Do you agree with? Yeah. Premise 2. You agree with? Yeah. Premise 3. You agree with? All the way down. Conclusion. Yeah, I agree with it. Okay.
Yeah,
then,
and over on hereticals, when we're talking over there, there's a lot of times I will want to, and I gotta admit, we have fun because we get the trolls. We don't get the actual legit thinkers.
Yeah.
we get the actual trolls.
You got some pretty dumb people over there.
So we play with them. I admit we play with them, but depending on what they're bringing up, we will actually try, or at least I know I do. I try to look at with their argument, what they're coming from, and then go from there, because I'm just gonna bring this one up because Tangelo tries to bring up the Shroud of Turin all the time.
Oh God,
and it's like, dude, we have shut this one down, so it's come to the point where we're just like, no, just shut up.
No, we did a whole episode on that.
When he first brought it to us, we showed him why. We legit went in and showed him the proofs of why this isn't real. But he still comes at it and it's like, all right, dude, now we're just going to fuck with you because...
What are you going to do at that point? Now, somebody says a positive claim that you don't have to justify or prove. Really? Yeah, okay, first of all, you can make a positive claim. You can make it unjustified, which doesn't mean... It means it's not rational. But I can claim anything I want. I can claim, hey, look, pigs are going to fly out of my ass and spit gold dollars right now. I can make that claim. I don't have to justify it. I'm not claiming it to be rational. I can still make the claim. You can accept it or not. I can also claim 1 + 1 + 2 = 2 and not have to justify it. You're going to deny that? No. So when you make a positive claim, you certainly don't have to prove it. Burden of proof does not mean prove. Okay, just like the Big Bang does not mean proof a bang. When the onus probandi started with a legal sense to mean prove to the court that there was enough evidence to have what's called a burden of production, to bring charges in the court to the court. Then you have a burden of persuasion, which would be enough evidence to convince a jury or judge that the defendant is guilty. But the defendant also has a lawyer there, and that lawyer has what's called a burden of defense. That is a positive burden, even though he is on the defense. There are many different types of burden of proof. There's burden of production, persuasion, burden of defense, burden epistemic burdens, discursory burdens, evidential burdens. A lot of different kinds of burdens. And just by even making a positive claim, it does not necessitate you actually have a burden. If I'm relating to you a dosastic state, hey, like Jay says, hey, Steve, do you believe A = A? And I say yes. Okay, I'm giving you a positive epistemic status, but I'm not under no obligation, discursory-wise, to explain to you why A = A. A = A. I don't have to prove to you it. I don't have to demonstrate it. I don't have to give you reasons. I don't need anything whatsoever, because you're asking me my dosastic state. So it's a self-reflective thing. It is an autobiographical assessment, it's called. I mean, does that make sense, Jay? If you ask me a question, like, something that I can answer yes or no to, like, do you believe something? Like, ask me if I believe A = A.
Yeah, do you believe A = A?
Yeah. Now, do I have any onus whatsoever to explain to you why?
No, unless I come at you, can you explain why?
I'm not interested. You just asked me my position.
Yeah.
Now, Sure, but I mean, but I'm not interested in persuading you. I have no burden of persuasion, right? Which is a type of burden of proof. But the only time I have a burden of proof where I have to actually prove something, or at least have an onus to, is I say, Jay, I can prove to you that 0.99 repeat. Now, then I have a burden to do so, an onus. Now, if I don't do it, there's no law of the universe is going to strike me down, hopefully. But I mean, I have a discursory onus to do so, because if I say I can prove something and I don't, you're like, well, yeah, you're lying. You're either lying to me, or I don't believe you, or you're just not somebody who I want to have a conversation with. When you would tell me you can prove something and you don't, so I have an obligation. Yes, I can prove it to you, or at least, you know what? I'm going to retract that. if I'm only telling you my dostostatic state that I can prove something, then I don't even have to prove something. Like say, hey, Steve, can you prove 0.99 repeat equals 1? Ask me.
Can you?
Yes. Do I have an onus to? No.
No.
Right? Because again, I'm only telling you my autobiographical assessment. See, isn't philosophy great? But I use that as a litmus test because I'm going to get atheists tell me, "Oh, I'll change my mind with evidence." I was on the Atheist Experience Discord, right? And I couldn't believe how many people are telling me, "Well, Steve, yeah, I would believe if they gave me enough evidence. So I don't believe there's a God, but I'm open to change my mind." Blah blah. I'm like, why do you tell me this shit? I don't care that you're open to change your mind. That's most people. That's just an epistemic virtue. In virtual epistemology, open-mindedness is a virtue. Okay, great. I assume that most rational people would change their mind with evidence. I'd rather know the person that says, "No, man, I'm not going to change my mind with evidence," because that's the person that's atypical, right?
Yeah.
That's the theist that goes, "No, man, this is the young earth creation. I will never change my mind." Well, got some problems there. The earth is flat. I'll never change my mind. Those are the people I'd rather know they're not going to change their minds. Else I assume that people will change their minds. This doesn't need to be added for expository. But they're like, "Steve, you're not listening to me." I'm like, "No, I've heard this a million times. I'm listening. I get it. You'll change your mind. Great. Whoop you. Okay, congratulations. You're like everybody else in the world." You know? Yes, April asked for a moderator wrench a while ago. But anyways.
But April also said, "It seems to me that the belief claims don't require explanation."
They require justification if you want them to be rational. Right? I believe A equals A, and I have rational reasons to believe this as a law of identity, and I can explain the axioms. Go read my page on the law of identity. Well, it's 3 laws of logic I wrote on my blog. People go read that, so they can see that I have an understanding of the basic understanding of these laws of logic. But if you want to, I'll give you a better example. Jay, ask me again if I believe A equals A.
Do you believe A equals A?
What would happen if I said no?
Nothing.
But what would happen? What would you look at me though? Would you not think that odd?
Well, I'd be like, well, why?
Yeah, it would require a little bit more to understand because that is such an atypical thing, right? I mean, it's irrational not to accept A equals A, right? So there's a burden of justification to even say, I don't believe A equals A, right? To have a non-belief requires a burden of justification to be rational, just like a positive case does. Because if I tell somebody, I don't believe A equals A, they're going to be like, you're irrational, right? But I need to rationally justify that non-belief, which I don't think anybody can do. I've listened to one person who actually believes A does not equal A ontologically, and they're an idiot, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, you would have to justify your non-belief, your non-acceptance. So even in atheism, if I don't accept the theist claim, that requires a burden of proof to be a rational non-acceptance. Even Michael Martin, he argued that exact same thing. Dr. Malik has argued that exact same thing. This is pretty common in philosophy. Ozian says, what do you think about justified true beliefs versus beliefs I believe are just justified as true? What do you mean? What's the difference between a true belief and a justified true belief as knowledge? That's called the value added problem. There have been people that have kind of recognized that if a belief is true, if it is true and you believe it, does it really add anything more to be justified or not? I don't know. It shouldn't, at least seems to me a greater degree of certainty. Because if certainty requires knowledge and knowledge requires belief, then it's just one subset of the other, right? So if an agent believes, if an agent is certain of P, then an agent also believes P, which also knows P, which entails it also believes P. So yes, on a gradient scale, I think knowledge is higher, but what value is actually added? If something is true and you believe it's true, is it, look, if I believe there's coffee in here and I drink it, and there's coffee in there, do I give a shit whether I know it or not? Does it add any value to it? No, I'm still drinking coffee. There's 1 sip of coffee left in there. By the way, I didn't know there was any coffee in there. I didn't remember there was a little bit of coffee left. So had I known there's coffee in there, does it make the coffee any less good? No, it's no value added. That's called a value added. Yeah, it's also called the swamping problem. Maki pointed out this swamping. Well, the swamping problem I think is a little more specific value added problem. The swamping problem deals with more specifically reliabilism. That there's no more value added by a reliable espresso maker than a non-reliable one. But it is part of the value added problem about what constitutive of knowledge. But the swamping problem is very specific to try to argue against reliabilism as an epistemic theory of knowledge versus along the lines of a justified true belief, which of course has its issues. But anyway, way off topic. But guys, thank you for this, Jay especially. That's 2 hour mark, and I'm gonna wrap it up. But dude, I miss hanging out with you, bro. I really do. You are one of the very few people that I have a lot of respect for anymore. I'm losing a lot of respect for you.
Mm-hmm.
I really, honest to God, exist. I think most of the people, well, I'm not gonna say most any longer. I'm gonna say the majority of the more well-known atheists are just scum. They're just I can't stand them. So I would like you and Chris to get very popular, so you can, you know.
Well, we're trying.
I can only promote so much, man. I don't have any popularity anymore. I'm way down here, and I'm comfortable down here because I ain't dealing with no bullshit. I get to do what I want.
But I had said earlier, we're fine where we're at because we would rather have those good discussions and good hearty laughs and stuff than sit there with 25,000 subscribers and just pumping out crap.
Quality versus quantity.
Yep, exactly.
And I got the Non Sequitur show for a little bit more eyes on a topic, but you know what? I have just as much fun doing this stuff on my channel, and I'm not gonna be talking about all kinds of subjects. I'm booked all the way to like May or something, and I got other topics I want to do on here, but I don't want to like saturate, So I'm doing this today, but I also have a show tomorrow. Then I'm gonna take a few days break, then I'll do a show, and so I'm pumping out content, interesting content. I hope people find it entertaining, but I really wish I don't stream every day. Okay.
Yeah, I really wish I could have been there for Monday's show because Mr. Intelligent Design's back, and that just could be funny as hell.
Oh, you're not gonna be able to make it?
No, I can't make it because I don't get out till 10.
Oh, okay. Well, you may not be able to watch it live, but I will guarantee that tomorrow will be a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
So those of you guys don't know, real quick, Mr. Intelligent Design is back, and we're going to go over his new whatever it's called, and he's going to help us understand it, Jay. Real time.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want Too Long Didn't Read version? It's pretty bad.
I can imagine.
There will be dumpsters. There will be fires. All right. All right, guys. Thanks for watching this. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to do all that other YouTube-y stuff. Share the video and leave comments, and I appreciate it. Again, I don't give a shit if 100 people watch this or 1,000 people watch it. This is the kind of shit that I enjoy doing. And I appreciate you joining me.
Be water, my friends.
Good night.